Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here for a second time with Dr. Hugo Mercier. He's a research scientist at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, where he works with the Evolution and Social Cognition team. And we are here today to talk about his most recent book, Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. And by the way, I have the book here, so go and buy it. It's a fantastic book. So Dr. Mercier, thank you a lot for taking the time again to come on the show.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, great. So, I mean, this is interesting because I guess that we could say that the premise of your book is that in psychology, in academic psychology, let's say, people have been putting forward the idea for a very long time that we are very gullible and that we fall easily for traps and manipulation and deception and things like that. But the evidence you present there run against that narrative, right?
Yes, and that's true not only for academic psychologists, or at least some of them, but we have the same trend, I think, in a lot of like political science or philosophy through the ages until quite recently, and also in kind of lay people's perception of how other people react to information. So, for instance, there's the well-known third-party effect, such that whenever you ask people, are you easily influenced by the news, by advertising, by political campaigns and whatnot, people consistently say that they are not easily influenced, but that other people are. And so it seems as if, for most of history, there has been this widespread idea that people are kind of easily convinced, easily persuaded, that they trust the wrong people, that they are easily misled by people who are just kind of charismatic or prestigious, and indeed, I think the evidence points in completely the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, why do you think that this narrative has been running for so long? I mean, do you think that there has been some biases in the production of scientific publications in psychology, for example, that people have been interpreting the results in a wrong way or over-interpreting them, or what exactly?
There's a bit of many things. For instance, in social psychology, it's quite well known that people like to show that people are stupid. Like, it's easier to publish if you're going to point out how irrational people are in such and such settings, rather than showing that they're quite smart. And so, at the same time as you have a number of publications pretending to claim people are gullible, you also have a number of publications pretending to show that people are incredibly pig-headed and that they never change their minds. And so, which you don't think people could be really both at the same time. And so there's some of that. Obviously, that only applies to the last few decades of social psychology, and for most of history, there has been a number of reasons why people would have believed in a way that people were gullible, and I think some of them were that it was politically expedient. So for a long time, you had like a right-wing narrative, according to which if you let people vote, if you give people too much of a voice in government, they would be easily misled by demagogues, and so they would make decisions that would be bad for them. And then there was like a more of a left-wing narrative, which had to explain why people were not revolting en masse against their overlords, and the idea was that they as well were being kind of gullibly accepting the dominant bourgeois ideology, and so I think there are political reasons why this kind of gullibility idea was successful, which are quite distinct from the ones it has been successful in social psychology.
Mm-hmm. Right. But still, we have evolved some cognitive mechanisms that lead us to believe easily in certain things that don't correspond to reality, correct?
Not really. So on the whole, we should, our cognitive mechanisms should be aimed at having an accurate representation of the world, because if you don't, you tend to die faster anyway. And so there might be exceptions, but on the whole, our cognitive mechanisms are geared towards accuracy. As a trade-off between accuracy and the cost of processing and whatnot. But on the whole, we want to have reliable information about the world. And that is true as well for communication. So we want to make sure that the people who tell us things are on the whole reliable. Otherwise, we would just be better off not listening to them altogether.
Yeah. And what about this phenomenon that you talk about in your book, adaptive credulity? I mean, what are the kinds of things that people tend to follow, the trends perhaps in their in-group or something like that?
Yes, so one reason that has been suggested for why credulity might be advantageous is that we have a lot to learn from others, and so some have argued that it's better to rely on very simple heuristics, such as, well, I'm always going to do whatever the majority does, or I'm always going to do whatever people who are very prestigious do. And obviously that's a simplification of their views, but that people would rely on these simple heuristics, and the idea would be that given that it's so hard to figure out who is right, and given that we rely so much on information from others, it's better to accept too many things than to reject too many things. But I think that logic is mistaken.
So you think it's mistaken? We've evolved some mechanisms, like, for example, mechanisms of open vigilance and that sort of thing, basically. So could you tell us a little bit about that? What are some of the mechanisms that we use to avoid being deceived or predated by other people and things like that?
So just to finish the transition with what I was saying, I guess I think the flow in the idea that it can make sense to be quite credulous and gullible because we have so much information to learn from others is that it doesn't take into account the strategic components that you have in communication. In that people might just try to mislead you and to manipulate you, to try to lie to you, etc. And once you take that into account, it becomes pretty clear that if we relied on kind of rough heuristics, it would be too easy for others to influence us to our detriment. And so instead, I think we have to be endowed, humans have to be endowed with mechanisms of what I've called, as you were saying, open vigilance, or what Lance Faber and as had called earlier, mechanisms of epistemic vigilance. And the function of these mechanisms would be to triage, to filter communicated information so that we are more likely to be influenced by reliable sources, by plausible information, etc. And on the whole, we tend to gain from communication instead of being at a risk of being too easily manipulated.
So, and that's interesting because in psychology there has been also this dual process approach to the human mind, where people talk about system 1 and system 2, and system 2 would be basically the rational aspect of our mind that would be slower and more rational and things like that. But as we talked even in our first interview, you don't agree that there's that sort of strict divide, and in this book you expand and say that system 1 is also not that fallible. Right?
No, yeah, exactly. So I think indeed, as you're describing, there's this common view of the mind as being composed of a set of kind of intuitive mechanisms that will be kind of your emotions, your intuitions, things you do quickly and effortlessly and without thinking too much about. That would be opposed to this system 2 that is more reflective, and so it's when you take your time, you're kind of effortfully engaging in kind of high level cognition, explicit cognition, and oftentimes associated with that is the idea that these system 1 mechanisms would be kind of gullible. It would be easy to fool. Like they would just accept anything. Whereas our system 2 mechanisms would be the ones that allow us to reject information and to be more careful. And I think this view fits very well with the whole kind of family of views across history that associate lack of education, kind of lack of intelligence, lack of sophistication, or kind of perceived lack of these things with gullibility. So throughout history, the people who have been perceived as being gullible were the masses, women, slaves, children, even kind of animals. And so there's a very strong association, I think, and it's quite intuitive between being kind of less sophisticated, less smart, or maybe just more tired or less educated, and being easier to influence. And I think this is completely wrong, and that the way it actually works is that our most kind of basic intuitive mechanisms are the most kind of cautious mechanisms. They really tend to reject most of the things we hear. And it's only when our when our more sophisticated mechanisms and probably more recently evolved mechanisms kick in that we get to accept information. So we can accept more information. So, for instance, if I tell you something that clashes with your prior beliefs, your first reaction will be to reject it. But then, if you realize that maybe I'm an expert in that area or that I present good arguments, then you might come to change your mind.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then there's also, as I've already mentioned, people think that we have this more rational part of our human mind, but we can also use the so-called system to accept more easily some questionable beliefs, right? So it can work against those sorts of interests.
Yes. So on the whole, what happens, I think, is that as you get more educated and you pay more attention to information, and you spend more time processing information, or you have access to more information the way we do in our societies now, what happens is that I think on the whole the ratio of good to bad information increases, but the amount of information increases even faster, and so it feels as if people are accepting even more false information. But they're also accepting even more true information, but we tend to pay less attention to that. And so what you get is that, for instance, people who tend to be at the forefront of kind of scientific or intellectual life, they will tend to accept a lot of true ideas, and it works well. But they will also be the ones who will tend to accept the quirky, crazy new ideas instead of the kind of old-style superstition and beliefs like that would be ridiculed. But they will also be the ones who will accept, kind of weird political doctrines like, communism to some extent, or cold fusion, or some weird new fancy cure. And so, even though on the whole they are good at discerning good beliefs from bad, and they accept many good new beliefs because of that, they also accept kind of more false beliefs, or kind of more innovative or different false beliefs than other people.
Mm-hmm. So, what happens when people are exposed to novel information? I mean, do they care about the source of it? Do they try to see if it fits with their pre-existing beliefs? I mean, what's the basic process that people go over?
So I think the way it works, and most of these things will work in parallel, is the first thing, or one thing that is sure to happen is that you will compare whatever is communicated to your pre-existing beliefs. And if you don't do that, you can't even understand what the sentence means. So you have to use your knowledge about the world to make sense of the sentence. So you can't avoid that phase. And if what you're told clashes with what you believe about the world, you will automatically detect this inconsistency, and kind of alarm bells will ring. At the same time, or maybe after, I don't know, that you also weight the how much trust you have in the source. Mm-hmm. So that means both. There are kind of two components of trust. One is, and it's not entirely you can call it trust, but kind of two components of the evaluation of the source of the information. One is how competent the source is. So if I know, for instance, that you've talked to a friend of ours recently, then I know you can give me reliable information about them. Or if I know you're very, very knowledgeable about computers, I can trust your advice regarding computers. And the other component that matters about sources is whether we think they have our interest at heart. So if I think you're a salesman, I'm going to discount what you say about the thing you're trying to sell. Sorry. By contrast, if I think you're a good friend of mine and you want us to have good relationships, a good relationship, then I will be much more likely to trust you. And so you have the basic content mechanism, you have trust, and then maybe the most sophisticated bit is argumentation. In that, sometimes I'm in a situation in which trust isn't enough. So maybe you might trust me a little bit, but not enough for you to change your mind if I tell you something that challenges your beliefs. And then I can give you arguments to try to show you, look, actually, you'd be more consistent, you'd be better off accepting the conclusion I want to defend than sticking with your former beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. So, and then I guess that because these beliefs that people have about how we are all so gullible and things like that come many times from academia and places like that, from intellectual people, let's say. There's also that idea that the reason behind why many people trust, for example, demagogues and populists and people like that in politics, for example, is because of their lack of sophistication. But that's not really what explains why people trust some people and do not trust others.
No, indeed. And if you look at most cases of demagogues and populists, well, the name says it all. I mean, they just represent views of people that were not previously represented as a rule. And so the causality, I mean, because they often represent people who we're not really familiar with, it feels as if the causality runs from the demagogues to the people, and we realize, wow, all these people are agreeing with them, so it must be because these demagogues hold such a sway over the population. When in fact the causality is nearly completely the opposite. That these demagogues, these kind of political entrepreneurs, have managed to tap into popular opinion in a way that other people hadn't before, and that's why they're popular, because they. Either they give people what they want, either literally in material terms, or at least in terms of having their ideas represented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it tends to be the other way around, right? Demagogues and populists try to profit on what people believe at the moment, or at least some sort of narrative that would go well with the current situation. And try to get at power or to get more power, right? That's the kind of thing that tends to happen, and not the other way around.
No, it's very rare for demagogues to have a deep influence on the people they represent. I mean, they can have some influence at the margin. So we know that in general, when people follow politicians, whether they're however populist they might be, when people like a given politician because that politician has represented their views, time and time again, and they've kind of defended their opinion and their incentives. Then, if that politician takes a position on some issue that people don't really care about, people will tend to accept that position. So, I don't know if you're in the U.S. and you're a big Bernie Sanders fan, and you don't know anything about tax treaties, and he supports a given tax treaty. Trade treaty, and it supports a given trade treaty, then you will tend to also support the treaty because you have no opinion about that. It doesn't really impact your life in any meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And so politicians, like other institutions or other popular figures, have some influence at the margin with the people who have kind of good reasons to trust them in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. So. You also mentioned there at some point the fact that people also care about argumentation and about being persuaded by other people if, for example, they have the wrong beliefs, and then they might update the information. So that also takes us back to our first discussion where we talked about the argumentative theory of reason, right? That was proposed by you and then Sperber. So what is the role that really argumentation and reason play in this context?
Well, the way it works, I think, is that we can use arguments, as I was briefly describing earlier, we can use arguments to change other people's minds, and we use arguments to evaluate whether someone who we might not trust enough to just accept whatever they're saying, whether actually what they're saying is valuable and we should change our minds. Mm-hmm. And you can see that, I think you can see that best in the way small groups work. So if you have a small group of people who have some common incentive to solve a problem, to figure out whatever is true, for instance, and they're faced with a problem and they don't all agree on what the correct answer is. Typically, discussion will allow either whoever has the best answer or whoever has bits of the best answer to convince others to accept the best answer. And so you can see performance improve as people discuss with each other, as good ideas spread, and a lot of that is through argumentation. And we know that because, for instance, because people can explain why they change their minds, they can convince others, they can solve other problems that really reflect a deep understanding. And so we know that argumentation can work really well in some settings in getting people to change others' minds through good arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, in general, would you say that the kinds of intuitions we tend to have, I mean, intuitions, for example, we could even try to connect this with the so-called core knowledge, and in this case, probably specifically more with folk psychology and how we think about the minds of other people and the way we interact and communicate with them. Would you say that our intuitions tend to be sound or not?
Yes, in the vast majority of the cases, yes. Otherwise, we couldn't function, and there would have been, some such intuitions would have been selected out, I guess. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, in our kind of modern environments, we're called to think about problems that our minds didn't evolve to solve at all. Yeah. And so, for instance, if you start thinking about, what is the origin of life? Why does it feel as if stars were, turning around the Earth? Why does the sun go down at night? Why do I get sick? Why do I get better? If you start thinking about all of these things, you might find some intuition that seems to speak to the question, but these intuitions will be all misguided because we have had no reason to evolve cognitive mechanisms that would give us proper answers to these questions. Even in the case of sickness and health, that we have a great immune system, but understanding why we get sick or why we get better wouldn't have made that much of a difference. And so because we have these wrong intuitions, then that leads us not only to just kind of spontaneously form mistaken beliefs when we think about these things, but also that drives the way we evaluate communication. So if you've never really thought about the shape of the Earth, and you have kind of pre-scientific society, and someone tells you the Earth is flat, well, it seems pretty intuitively compelling because it's what you see, and you don't really care either way. So it'd be easy to accept a false belief in that case because your intuitions are misleading.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it the case that perhaps in that example of the flat Earth or flat earthers, for example, that it is also easy for people to believe in that sort of thing, not only because it's what we see, but also the fact that it doesn't have any sort of real impact in our lives, believing it one way or the other.
Yes, no, exactly. Yeah, so and that's true. I think for the vast majority of kind of popular false beliefs, from conspiracy theories to, even false kind of medical beliefs to a large extent. Sorry.
No problem.
People will say a number of things, and some of them will sound quite crazy, including the belief that the Earth is flat. But most people will not act on these beliefs in any ways, fortunately. So. Yeah, as you were saying, the case of the fact that the Earth is flat, you hear of a few cases in which people spend quite a lot of money to try to prove that it's true, but the vast majority of the people even who claim that it is true, don't do anything about it. Or if they do things that are quite, kind of enjoyable, like they go to conferences, they meet other people who share their views, they enjoy presumably they enjoy the social contact. So it's not clear they engage in a lot of behavior that is costly based on that belief. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, we've already talked a little bit about this, but how do we decide who we should trust?
So we're going to use a wide variety of cues based on our experience with the people we talk to. So one thing that I want to stress is that one thing we do not use, or if we do, then we shouldn't really, is kind of behavioral cues. So for instance, there's a big literature trying to figure out whether you can spot who is a liar based on whether people are looking you in the eye, whether people are fidgeting, whether people are kind of showing any of these small kind of behavioral cues. And this literature pretty clearly shows that these cues are extremely unreliable, and that if people rely on them, they shouldn't. And it makes sense because there is no reason why people who are attempting to deceive others should be so transparent in their attempt at lying. And there is no reason why, if fidgeting was giving people away, they would be able to stop fidgeting, or evolution would have prepared us to lie in a way that is completely impossible to detect in that way. And so the way people do it instead is that we keep track of what people have said, and we check what they have said against what happens. Mm-hmm. And so if you give me advice, if you tell me, oh, I think you should go out with that person, and I go on a date with them, and the date proves to be terrible, then the next time you try to advise me on who to date, I won't listen to you. Mm-hmm. And even kind of besides your sheer competence, if I suspect that you are lying to me, then my trust in you will take an even bigger hit. So essentially, we look at two things. So we look at the past. We look at people's kind of past performance. Have they given us reliable advice? Have they been are kind of disinterested advice? And we look at the future in that we try to figure out what are people's incentives. Mm-hmm. And so if I think that you have an incentive to lie to me, then I will trust you less. Even if in the past, for instance, if you may be my best friend, but if we played poker together, I'm not going to listen to any advice you might give me because I know we're in a zero-sum game. And so people, and including very young children, are able to take these cues into account and to kind of weigh them to decide how much trust they should place in others.
Mm-hmm. So it's not that easy to deceive other people, and also for other people to deceive us, right? I mean, at least it doesn't go as far as some people have been presenting the case.
So it's not that it's not easy; it's that it's held in check by reputational mechanisms, and so in a way it is trivially easy. So, I could go to a good friend of mine and tell them, look, I really need money, or ask them to do something like some significant sacrifice, and they would do it for me. But then, if it turns out I was misleading them, then I've lost a very good friend. Mm-hmm. So it's in a way, it's manipulating people is easy, but only once time, and it's extremely costly. Mm-hmm. And so it's also hard in that it took years to build that friendship. So it seems like a bit of a stupid to jeopardize it over some minor lie. And so it's easy once you have built good relationships. Then it's easy to manipulate people, but then you lose the relationships. And building good relationships with while manipulating people is extremely hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's easier when we have, for example, a personal relationship with someone, because maybe people are a little bit more open and trustful, but then we have more to lose from it.
And that's why the very reason why they trust you is because they know you have more to lose from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and there's also this thing that you talk about in the book, because over time, as we said right at the beginning, people have been talking a lot about the madness of crowds and how people are easily influenced by people around them, and how when they are in crowds they simply go mad sometimes and do all sorts of crazy things. Mm-hmm. But in your book you point to what you call the wisdom of crowds. So would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, so the wisdom of crowds is obviously an old expression, but so I guess there are 2 points there. One is to try to dispel the view that crowds are prone to panic or to kind of bloodlust or to be kind of easily led to do nonsensical things by demagogues and leaders. And the other is to point out that on the contrary, crowds can actually be quite smart in some ways. But the first point is just the evidence, the historical evidence on this is completely unambiguous. And crowds don't go berserk, they don't panic, so they can do horrible things. They can crowds, people in crowds can they can engage obviously in rape, in looting, in murder, in lynching, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. But they tend to do so in a way that, on the whole, as immoral as it might be, is much less kind of frantic or kind of irrational that might appear. And so, for instance, if you look at all the kind of typical kind of revolutionary crowds, whether it was kind of during the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the number of kind of peasant revolutions, in most cases, these crowds are extremely are much kind of tamer than we would imagine to be. And so, for instance, we have all these examples of like during the French Revolution, of crowds managing to take they take the Bastille and they kill maybe one guy even though they've been shot a lot. They take the Tuileries. And they only, or they take, where the king was, and they only kill the Swiss guards because they're the only ones who are not, were just giving their lives for the king. And so, in all of these cases, the crowds act in a way that is actually pretty. I mean, it might be morally wrong in many ways, but it's sensible enough. And it's the same for panic. So if you look at at the cases of supposed panic. In fact, when there's a disaster, people tend to engage in a lot of pro-social acts. So, for instance, like this friend who studied the Bataclan shooting in Paris, and the reaction of the audience, and people were very keen to try to help each other, try to help people who are kind of hurt or otherwise, young people or older people, and if there is a panic, it's only when it's warranted. Like if you have a fire and everybody wants to get through a small exit, the rational thing to do is to try to go through that exit. So it's not so much that the crowd is triggering this kind of irrational emotions, but it's that sometimes being in a crowd makes you act in a way that is rational, but that might be morally problematic.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked about politics and politicians, and what about the media, and more specifically, if you want to talk about that, the social media? Because many people have been saying that the media really have a very big impact on how people think, on how people see the world, on the decisions they make, particularly political decisions, how they vote, and things like that. But is that correct?
So yes and no. So it is correct in that without the media, we wouldn't know who the politicians are, we wouldn't know what their platform is. And so to the extent that the media and even political campaigns provide information about what who the candidates are, what parties they belong to, what are their positions, then they can affect the public. What they do not seem to do is to change people's minds. So once you have, what your positions are, and some issues are important to you, and you know what the politicians' positions are, well, given that, it's going to be really hard to change your mind. Mm-hmm. So the media and political campaigns mostly work kind of at the margin so either, as I was saying, by just informing the public about the positions of politicians, or by having kind of very, very subtle effects on motivating people to go to get to vote, but these effects are extremely tiny by comparison with the vast amounts that are spent trying to get people to change their minds or to go vote.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when, for example, political candidates pour their money into social media campaigns and things like that, do they really have a big effect in swaying people one way?
It seems not. Yeah, it seems not. So the best evidence we have comes from a number, like there's over 50 now, large-scale randomized controlled trials in which in half of a city, for instance, you will, like in half of the electoral districts of a city, you will do canvassing or robocalling, or in half of the TV markets, you will run some TV ads, and in the other half, you do nothing, or you do some other strategy, and then you see whether the markets or the electoral districts in which you have done the intervention are more likely to vote for your candidate than for the other. And all of these things show that the effects are either zero in the case of like general elections, so elections like the presidential elections in the US, where people already have a lot of information about the candidates, and they have small effects, like really small effects, on elections in which people have less information or can't just rely on simple heuristics to make decisions. So, for instance, on primaries or in ballot measures, then you can have a bit of an impact. But it's still relatively small compared to the resources that are poured into trying to get people to change their minds.
Mm-hmm. And what about political radicalization? Because people could ask, okay, so maybe if social media and the media in general don't influence people that much in terms of their decision, in terms of who they're going to vote on, and things like that. Can social media and the rest of the media make people's opinions and positions more extreme because they are exposed to more and more of the content they seek out for?
In theory, it could be possible, and indeed, it has been a fear of many that the social media were creating echo chambers and filter bubbles that would allow their users to insulate themselves from any dissenting view and to only expose themselves to more kind of congenial opinions. On the whole, it doesn't seem to have happened. So on the whole, most of the data suggests that either using social media has no effect on polarization and on this kind of informational isolation, or that it has positive effects. And so in a way, it's kind of intuitive enough because, for instance, if you think of Facebook, then obviously most people have vastly more friends or so-called friends on Facebook than they often or that they regularly see in real life. Mm-hmm. And so just because of this, you will be exposed to you're much more likely to be exposed to dissenting views on Facebook than in real life. And so, for instance, there was recently an experiment in which the authors paid people to stay on Facebook for a number of weeks. And at the end, the effects were essentially very, very small on all kinds of polarization. But people who were on Facebook were more aware of news that were kind of going against their political leanings than people not on Facebook, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's interesting because that's one thing that people, when they talk about Facebook, for example, that they don't usually consider that even though there might be some echo chamber effect, let's say, we also have the opposite. People are also exposed to a wider range of ideas and different ideas and things like that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you can see also when people tend to forget that even though clearly social media are a vector for a lot of misinformation to spread, they're also a vector for a lot of positive true and kind of accurate information to spread. And I think Twitter in the recent crisis has been a good example in that. Mm-hmm. It feels as if Twitter was one of the first places in which the alarm bell was rung after the epidemic started in China. It was much earlier than what you would have seen in most mainstream media, in other social media sites, or in the kind of political discourse. And so there are also kind of upsides, and social media also can be great ways for communication to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, from a psychological standpoint, that is basically where you come from. Apart from the several different measures people on social media have been adopting to avoid the spread of misinformation or to contain it, do you think that there are any good strategies that we could try to implement or follow to also fight that kind of thing?
So first of all, I guess the first caveat is that I don't think it matters all that much. In the same way as I don't think that the true information we see on these, or true in the sense that it's kind of genuine political messages and whatnot. I don't think it has that much of an impact. All the evidence suggests that fake news and everything have essentially zero or extremely tiny impact on political views, and that it's really as in the case of demagogues and populists, the causality runs the other direction. So it's not because people believe such and such fake news that then they will hold such and such political opinion, but it's the other way around. So, for instance, there was a nice study about the rumor that Obama was a Muslim that circulated quite a lot, for instance, in the 2008 elections or in the campaigns. And what some researchers have shown is that people who disliked Obama were more likely to accept the rumor, but accepting the rumor did not make them dislike Obama more, even though presumably a lot of these people would have been prejudiced against Muslims. And so it seems that even though I'd much rather no one believed that Obama was a Muslim, it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact that many people accepted that, because they only accepted it because they already disliked Obama.
Okay, so and perhaps just one last question, because I've already went through most of the questions I have here. Why do you think this sort of idea that people are really gullible and they fall easily prey for politicians and bad ideas and misinformation and things like that, and also that thing about the madness of crowds and how people go mad easily and crazy? Why do you think that's popular and from a cultural evolutionary standpoint a successful idea that spreads easily?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, because I've never kind of tested the hypothesis I've kind of formed, but I think one of them is that it gives us a good way of explaining why so many people disagree with us. And so, for instance, if you're a Democrat in the U.S. and you imagine all these Republicans as being kind of caricatures of Republicans, so being like completely, kind of against abortion, against all forms of abortion, completely, pro-gun, completely, pro free market, etc. So you have this caricature, which is mostly false, because people actually, Democrats and Republicans, differ much less than they think they differ. But anyway, you have this image in mind, and you want to try to understand how can people have views that to you are so wrong and kind of morally abhorrent and just mistaken. And I think the idea that, well, it's just because they're all kind of watching Fox News or they're all influenced by Trump is tempting, rather than thinking, well, they're just, a lot of these people are just stupid and racist, and I think it's given what you think they are, which is false in the first place. It's tempting to, it's in a way it's kind of charitable to think them gullible instead of them having had on their own all these ideas that you think are so wrong. So I think that's one of the appeal of that. Yeah.
So I mean, as we mentioned before, maybe many of those people think that they are more rational than most people, but then they might also easily fall prey for their own biases and what they say other people fall prey for.
Yes, so on the whole, as I was saying earlier, there's this kind of third-person effect by which people believe they're not easily influenced and they believe other people are. And actually people are right about themselves, but they're also right to the extent that they're also not easily influenced even when they should. And so people are right in that it's true they're not easily taken in by stupid ads and political campaigns and all that. But it's also true that we tend to reject a lot of information that is good. So you still had a lot of people who kind of don't believe in climate change, people who don't believe in vaccination, people who don't believe in evolution, etc., or people who keep smoking and or refuse to accept that cigarettes are as bad as we know they are. And so the main issue is really that we reject too much information, and we think we're so smart, but in fact, in just about every domain, there are people who are vastly more competent than we are, and that we don't realize how kind of the gap in expertise there is between us and kind of scientists in particular in just about every domain. And because of that, partly because of that, we tend to not accept enough information.
Mm-hmm. So my last question will be, because some of these things people are a little bit worried about, and I think they should, like, for example, you mentioned anti-vaxxers, and that's a real issue because they might compromise herd immunity and some diseases might come back and things like that. So what would you tell people to try to calm them down a little bit when they are worried about the spread of misinformation and fake news and these false beliefs and things like that?
Yeah, so I think I guess the message I'm bringing is both kind of optimistic and pessimistic. So it's optimistic in that I think there's good evidence showing that people are much harder to influence than we think they are. And so, for instance, if many more people were exposed to, McCarthy or other prominent anti-vaxxers, most people wouldn't change their minds. It wouldn't make that much of a difference. Mm-hmm. But the flip side is that it's also going to be hard to change people. It is indeed hard to change people's minds to accept the right ideas. And so, for instance, in the case of anti-vaccination, since the very beginning of vaccination, in particular, since the first attempts at enforcing vaccination in the UK, there has always been resistance. The only cases in which you don't have a pretty a decent resistance against vaccination is when a disease is so salient and obvious, when you had that with polio, and you might have that with coronavirus if they find a vaccine now. That the benefits of vaccination really completely outweigh any perceived cost. Mm-hmm. But essentially, my prediction is that unless at some point we have a population that is so well educated that everybody has understood why vaccination is good, as soon as you relax that very, very that massive inflow of information and education on that topic, people will go back to thinking that vaccination is not good, because intuitively, I think it's a very counterintuitive form of therapy, which is very unfortunate. And so that's the negative side is that it's going to be hard, and people psychology aren't going to change, and so if you don't have a constant effort at correcting misconceptions, they're going to keep popping up again.
Mm-hmm. And that can only be done through some effort, because some of these things, particularly the ones related to science, because they tend to be counterintuitive, people really have to learn them the hard way because they are not intuitive.
Yes, especially so in the case of science, it's actually so it's true that indeed, as you were saying, most scientific beliefs are counterintuitive. So, for instance, I believe now that I'm spinning, I'm spinning around the Earth. The Earth is spinning around the Sun, and obviously, intuitively, it feels as if I'm not going anywhere. Or I believe that my desk is mostly made of void because it's the gap between the nucleus and the electrons and whatnot. And most of these counterintuitive beliefs, I accept them, because I trust science and I understand some of the arguments. But it's still relatively easy because it doesn't affect my behavior at all. By contrast, vaccination, not only is it counterintuitive, but it's asking you to engage in a behavior that feels costly, like you want to do a mildly painful operation on a perfectly healthy child. And so the fact that it's not only is it the principle is counterintuitive, but the action is costly, means that it makes it much harder than in the case of most scientific beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dr. Mercier, let's end on that note. And again, the book is not born yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. It's a great book. I really loved reading it. And I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview and also to the rest of your work. So thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and hopefully somewhere in the future we can have a further conversation, I hope.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It was great questions again. Thank you, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing quite a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And now, to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you prefer PayPal, I also have links to it in the description box of the interview. All of the links are there. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and supporters, the main ones, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikel Stormir, my producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, and Matthew Lavender, and my executive producer, Michal Rugieski. Thank you for all.